The text message arrived while I was sitting in a forward operating base in Afghanistan. Dust still caked under my fingernails from a convoy mission that had lasted 18 hours. The satellite connection was spotty, but the words came through. Crystal clear. Don't bother coming home, Sarah. I've moved on. So should you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stared at the screen of my encrypted phone, reading those 12 words over and over again while the generator hummed in the background of our temporary command post. My husband of 6 years had just ended our marriage via text message while I was serving my country 7,000 miles away. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd been protecting American freedoms while my own life was being dismantled by someone who'd sworn to love and honor me. My name is Sarah Rebecca Chen, and at 32, I'd just received what had to be the most cowardly goodbye in military history. But as I sat there in that dusty outpost, surrounded by fellow soldiers who'd become my chosen family, Marcus had no idea that his casual dismissal had just triggered a chain of events that would reshape both our lives in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The second message came 30 minutes later, when I was still processing the first. Ashley and I are together now. She understands what I need. Military wives aren't cut out for real relationships. Clear out your stuff when you get back. If you get back. Ashley, my younger sister Ashley, who I'd helped through college, who'd lived in our guest room for 8 months while she figured things out, who'd been texting me weekly updates about taking care of Marcus while I was deployed. The betrayal cut deeper than any IED blast I'd witnessed, more devastating than any firefight I'd survived. I was a captain in the Army Corps of Engineers, stationed with the 82nd Airborne Division on my second deployment to Afghanistan. This wasn't some desk job or safe zone assignment. I was leading convoy security operations, overseeing bridge reconstructions under hostile fire, and managing a team of 47 soldiers who depended on my judgment to get them home alive. The stress was constant, the responsibility overwhelming, and the physical demands pushed every limit of human endurance. But Marcus had always resented my service. During our courtship, he'd found my military bearing attractive, even sexy. He'd loved telling his friends at the law firm about his warrior woman girlfriend who could outshoot and outrun most men. The reality of military marriage, however, had proven less appealing. The deployments, the training exercises, the unpredictable schedules, and most importantly, my unwillingness to prioritize his career over my own had gradually eroded his initial attraction. What Marcus didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn despite 6 years of marriage, was that my military service had taught me something invaluable about preparation and contingency planning. In the Army, we call it operational security. In civilian terms, it means never assuming that people will act with honor when their self-interest is at stake. I'd been documenting things for months before this deployment. Not because I suspected Ashley specifically, but because Marcus's behavior had shifted in ways that triggered my professional instincts. The same instincts that kept me alive in combat. Zones were now protecting my personal life from threats I hadn't fully identified yet. 6 months earlier, Marcus had started working late more frequently. Not unusual for a corporate attorney, except that his billable hours weren't increasing. Proportionally, he'd become secretive about his phone, protective of his laptop, and dismissive when I asked about his day. Small changes that most spouses might rationalize, but which my military training had taught me to recognize as operational patterns indicating deception. So I'd started keeping records, screenshots of financial statements, copies of important documents, photographs of suspicious receipts, and most importantly, a detailed log of his behavior patterns and inconsistencies, not out of paranoia, but out of the same methodical preparation that had kept my soldiers alive in hostile territory. The third message arrived an hour later, this time longer and more detailed. I've been talking to Jackson about the house. Since you're never here anyway, it makes sense for me to keep it. Ashley's already moved her stuff into your closet. We're thinking about starting a family soon. Real family values, not this military obsession of yours. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Jackson was Marcus's law partner, a sharp-y divorce attorney who specialized in high-asset dissolutions. The mention of his name confirmed that this wasn't a spontaneous emotional decision. Marcus had been planning this betrayal for weeks, possibly months, timing it deliberately to coincide with my deployment when I'd be least able to respond effectively. What he didn't realize was that I'd been planning too. I walked outside the command post, needing air and space to process what was happening. The Afghan sunset painted the mountains in shades of amber and gold, a beauty that remained stunning despite the constant threat of violence. My fellow soldiers were gathered around a makeshift fire pit, sharing stories and decompressing from the day's mission. These people understood loyalty, sacrifice, and honor in ways that Marcus apparently never had. Captain Rodriguez, my second in command, noticed my expression and approached with concern. "Everything okay back home, Cap?" I considered lying, maintaining the professional facade that military leadership demanded. Instead, I found myself sharing the truth with someone who'd earned my trust through shared danger and mutual respect. "My husband just divorced me via text message while I'm deployed." Rodriguez's expression darkened. "That's some serious disrespect right there." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What are you going to do? The question hung in the air while I considered my options. I could accept Marcus's version of events, allow him to control the narrative and outcome. I could return home devastated and defeated, playing the role of the abandoned military wife who'd sacrificed her marriage for her service. Or I could respond with the same strategic thinking that had made me an effective leader in one of the world's most challenging environments. "I'm going to remind him that he married a soldier," I said finally. "And soldiers don't surrender without a fight." That night, while my fellow soldiers slept in their bunks, I sat in the communications tent with my laptop, using the base's secure internet connection to begin implementing contingency plans I'd hoped never to need. Military operations require extensive preparation for multiple scenarios, and my personal life had received the same level of strategic planning. The first step was financial reconnaissance. I logged into our joint accounts, expecting to find evidence of Marcus's preparation for this betrayal. What I discovered exceeded even my suspicious expectations. Over the past 4 months, he'd been systematically transferring money from our joint savings into accounts I didn't recognize. Small amounts initially, then larger sums as my deployment progressed and his confidence grew. But Marcus had made a critical error in his operational planning. He'd assumed that my military service made me financially naive, that my focus on combat readiness meant I wasn't paying attention to domestic details. This assumption had led him to overlook a crucial fact about my background that would prove to be his undoing. Before joining the Army, I'd earned a degree in finance from Georgetown University. My military occupational specialty was engineering, but my education had provided me with sophisticated understanding of asset protection and financial planning. More importantly, my family background had taught me lessons about money and power that Marcus had never suspected. My grandfather had been a successful real estate developer who'd built a substantial portfolio of commercial properties throughout Virginia and Maryland. When he'd passed away 2 years into my marriage, he'd left a trust fund that provided me with financial independence I'd never mentioned to Marcus. Not out of deception, but because military culture emphasized merit over wealth, and I'd wanted my achievements to stand on their own. The trust was managed by a law firm in Washington, D.C. that specialized in military families, and it included provisions specifically designed to protect assets during deployment. My grandfather had been a World War II veteran who understood the unique vulnerabilities that military service created for families. As I reviewed the trust documents on my laptop, I realized that Marcus's attempt to seize our joint assets would trigger protective mechanisms he didn't know existed. The irony was perfect. While he was consulting his divorce attorney friend about claiming our house, he was completely unaware that I owned 3 commercial buildings and a substantial investment portfolio that would dwarf his law firm's salary. But more immediately relevant was the discovery I made in our joint checking account activity. Marcus hadn't just been transferring money to prepare for our divorce. He'd been funding a lifestyle that included expensive restaurants, hotel reservations, and purchases that clearly indicated he'd been planning this relationship with Ashley for months. I screenshot every transaction, every suspicious charge, every piece of evidence that demonstrated premeditation and deception. My military training had taught me that documentation wins battles, and this was shaping up to be a war. The 4th message from Marcus arrived just after midnight Afghanistan time. Stop trying to log into our accounts. I've changed all the passwords. Jackson says you're probably going to try to make this difficult, but we both know you don't have the resources to fight me on this. Just accept reality and move on. His arrogance was breathtaking, but also tactically useful. Overconfident, opponents make critical errors, and Marcus was revealing information about his strategy that would prove valuable in countering it. He'd involved Jackson in the financial manipulation, which meant the divorce attorney was potentially complicit in improper asset transfers. He'd assumed I lacked resources, which meant he hadn't done proper reconnaissance on my actual financial position. Most importantly, he was treating this as a legal battle where superior resources guaranteed victory, rather than understanding that he was now facing someone with combat experience who specialized in asymmetric warfare. I composed my response carefully, keeping it brief and emotionally neutral. Understood. We'll handle arrangements when I return. The message was deliberately vague, designed to maintain his overconfidence while giving away nothing about my actual capabilities or intentions. Marcus would interpret it as capitulation, which would make him careless. In military terms, I was allowing the enemy to believe they'd achieved tactical surprise while I prepared my actual response. Over the next 48 hours, I used every spare moment between missions to implement what I privately called Operation Homecoming. Military planning requires detailed coordination across multiple domains, and I approached my personal situation with the same systematic thoroughness. First, I contacted the trust management firm in Washington. Eleanor Washington, the partner who'd handled my grandfather's estate, was a sharp woman in her 60s who specialized in protecting military families from financial exploitation. When I explained the situation, her response was immediate and decisive. "This is exactly why your grandfather structured the trust the way he did," she said during our secure video call. "Military spouses face unique vulnerabilities during deployment, and he wanted to ensure you had resources and legal protection if you ever needed them." Eleanor's firm would handle the divorce proceedings, providing legal representation that Marcus's friend Jackson wouldn't be expecting. More importantly, they would ensure that the asset transfers Marcus had been making would be scrutinized under Virginia's laws regarding financial misconduct during marriage dissolution. Second, I reached out to my older brother David, who worked as a private investigator in Richmond. David was a former Marine who'd transitioned to civilian security work, and he understood both military culture and the kind of documentation needed to build legal cases. I asked him to begin surveillance on Marcus and Ashley, not for emotional reasons, but to gather evidence that would support the legal strategy we were developing. Third, I contacted my commanding officer to request emergency leave for family crisis. Colonel Martinez was a career soldier who dealt with similar situations throughout her 20-year service. She understood immediately that this wasn't just personal drama, but a situation that required decisive action to protect a soldier's interests while deployed. "Take the time you need, Captain Chen," she said during our private meeting in her office. "But remember that the best revenge is living well and serving with honor. Don't let someone else's failure to appreciate your value diminish your own sense of worth." Her words resonated deeply, reminding me that this situation was ultimately about more than just Marcus's betrayal. It was about maintaining my integrity and self-respect while ensuring that his actions had appropriate consequences. The breakthrough came on my third day of investigation, when David called with information that transformed my understanding of the entire situation. Marcus and Ashley hadn't just been having an affair. They'd been systematically planning to defraud me of assets they believed I wouldn't be able to protect while deployed. "You need to see this," David said, sending encrypted files through our secure communication system. "I've been monitoring their communications and financial activity. This isn't just adultery, Sarah. It's conspiracy to commit fraud." The evidence was damning. Text messages between Marcus and Ashley discussing my deployment as an opportunity to clean house and start fresh without military complications. Financial records showing coordinated transfers from our joint accounts into investments they'd made together. Most shocking of all, a lease agreement for an apartment they'd signed 2 months into my deployment using forged documents that misrepresented our marital status. Marcus had been presenting himself as divorced to landlords, creditors, and business associates while I was serving in Afghanistan. He'd used my deployment as cover to begin a new life with Ashley, planning to present me with accomplished facts when I returned. The text message divorce wasn't an emotional decision. It was the final step in a months-long campaign of deception and financial manipulation. But David's investigation had also revealed Marcus's critical vulnerability. In his eagerness to establish a new life with Ashley, he'd made financial commitments that assumed he'd have exclusive access to our joint assets. The apartment lease, credit card applications, and investment accounts he'd opened all depended on income and assets. He wouldn't legally be entitled to once the divorce proceedings began. "He's overextended himself," David explained. "If you move quickly with the legal response, you can put him in a position where he'll have to negotiate rather than dictate terms." I spent that evening reviewing all the evidence David had gathered, cross-referencing it with my own documentation, and developing a comprehensive strategy for confronting Marcus when I returned home. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Arrive home unexpectedly, present him with complete evidence of his financial misconduct, and offer him a choice between negotiated settlement or extended legal warfare that would expose his behavior to professional and personal scrutiny. Military operations succeed through superior preparation, tactical surprise, and the ability to adapt quickly when circumstances change. Marcus believed he was fighting a desperate spouse with limited resources and options. Instead, he was about to face a combat veteran with financial resources, legal representation, and comprehensive intelligence about his activities. My return flight was scheduled to leave Afghanistan in 18 hours. Marcus expected me to arrive, home devastated and defeated, ready to accept whatever terms he dictated. Instead, I would be returning with a carefully planned counteroffensive that would remind him that soldiers don't just defend, they also know how to attack. The final message I sent to Marcus before boarding my transport flight was deliberately cryptic. "Flight departs Kandahar in 6 hours. Look forward to discussing our future arrangements in person." I turned off my phone after sending that message, knowing that the next time I communicated with my husband, it would be on my terms, in my time, with my choice of weapons. Marcus had started this war with a text message, believing he could win, through surprise and superior positioning. He was about to discover what happens when you underestimate a soldier. The wheels of the military transport touched down at Dover Air Force Base at 0347 hours on a cold Tuesday morning in March. I'd been traveling for 36 hours across 11 time zones, but adrenaline had kept me alert during the entire journey. While my fellow soldiers headed to processing and reunion with their families, I had a different kind of homecoming planned. David was waiting for me outside the terminal, his familiar Marine bearing unmistakable even in civilian clothes. My brother had aged in the 5 years since I'd last seen him in person, gray threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of difficult cases and hard-won wisdom. But his embrace was warm and reassuring, the kind of unconditional support that only family can provide. "Welcome home, warrior," he said quietly, taking my duffel bag and leading me toward his vehicle. "How are you holding up?" I considered the question honestly as we walked through the pre-dawn darkness. "Angry," I admitted, "but focused. This isn't about emotion anymore. It's about justice." David nodded approvingly. "Good. Emotion clouds. Judgment. Justice requires clarity." He opened the passenger door of his black SUV, modified with the kind of surveillance equipment that his private investigation work demanded. "I've got updates you need to hear before we reach Richmond." As we drove through the Virginia countryside, David briefed me on developments that had occurred during my travel time. The intelligence he'd gathered painted a picture of Marcus and Ashley's activities that was even more damaging than I'd initially understood. "They held a housewarming party last weekend," David reported, handing me a tablet loaded with photographs and video footage. "At your house. Ashley was introducing herself to the neighbors as Marcus's fiancée. They've been telling people died in combat." The photographs showed my living room filled with people I didn't recognize, Ashley wearing my jewelry and serving drinks from my kitchen. Marcus stood beside her with his arm around her waist, playing the role of grieving widower, moving on with a sympathetic younger woman. The calculated cruelty of the deception took my breath away. "There's more," David continued, his voice grim. "I traced their financial activities over the past week. They've been liquidating assets aggressively, converting everything they can access into cash and cryptocurrency. This isn't just about divorce settlement anymore. They're planning to disappear." I studied the financial records David had compiled, recognizing patterns that reminded me of insurgent funding operations I'd tracked in Afghanistan. Small transfers from multiple accounts, shell companies created with minimal documentation, and cryptocurrency wallets that would be nearly impossible to trace without sophisticated law enforcement resources. "Marcus withdrew $43,000 from your joint savings yesterday," David explained, highlighting specific transactions. "Ashley closed her checking account and converted everything to Bitcoin. They've also made inquiries about properties in Costa Rica and Panama, countries with limited extradition treaties." The scope of their planning was impressive, but it also revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of who they were dealing with. Marcus and Ashley were treating this like a civilian financial dispute, using tactics that might work against a typical spouse. They hadn't considered that they were now facing someone with military intelligence training and access to resources they couldn't comprehend. "What about the apartment lease you mentioned?" I asked, reviewing additional documents on the tablet. David smiled grimly. "That's where things get interesting. The property management company requires verification of income and marital status for leases above a certain amount. Marcus provided falsified documents claiming he was divorced and had exclusive access to your joint assets. That's wire fraud, potentially a federal crime." I felt a cold satisfaction reading through the evidence. Marcus's legal training should have warned him about the criminal implications of his actions, but arrogance had made him careless. He'd assumed that his status as an attorney would protect him from scrutiny, and that my military deployment made me powerless to respond effectively. "Have you contacted Eleanor Washington yet?" I asked, referring to the trust management attorney who would be handling my legal representation. "She's expecting your call within the hour," David confirmed. "Her firm has been reviewing the evidence I've gathered, and they're confident we have grounds for both civil and criminal charges. Marcus's law partner Jackson is also potentially facing ethics violations for his involvement in the financial manipulation." As we entered the outskirts of Richmond, I felt the familiar weight of pre-mission tension settling over me. This was the moment when planning transitioned to execution, when careful preparation would be tested against the chaos of actual combat. In Afghanistan, this feeling preceded convoy operations into hostile territory. Today, it preceded my return to a home that had been transformed into enemy territory while I was serving my country. "What's the tactical situation at the house?" I asked, switching into the professional mindset that had kept me alive in combat zones. David consulted his notes. Marcus left for his office 45 minutes ago. Ashley is still at the house, probably sleeping. She's been staying up late recently, posting on social media about her new life and decorating what she calls our new home. The neighbors have been asking questions about your absence, but Marcus has been maintaining the fiction that you're still deployed indefinitely. I checked my watch. 0615 hours, which meant I had approximately 9 hours before Marcus typically returned from work. Enough time to secure the house, gather additional evidence, and prepare the confrontation that would determine how this situation resolved. I want to approach this systematically, I told David as we turned onto my street. First, document everything in the house that's changed since my deployment. Second, secure any remaining assets or important documents. Third, establish communication with Eleanor Washington and finalize the legal strategy. Fourth, prepare for Marcus's return, with complete evidence presentation. The house looked different as we pulled into the driveway. Ashley's bright red Honda was parked where my car usually sat, and the landscaping had been changed to include flowers I'd never selected. Through the windows, I could see furniture had been rearranged and decorative items I didn't recognize. It was as if my home had been occupied by an invading force that was systematically erasing evidence of my existence. David handed me a small recording device. Document everything, he advised. Audio, video, photographs. We want a complete record of what they've done to your property and possessions. I clipped the device to my uniform and approached my own front door, keys feeling strange in my hand after months of deployment. The lock turned easily, but as I stepped inside, I was struck by how thoroughly Ashley had transformed the space. My family photographs had been replaced with pictures of her and Marcus. My books had been moved to make room for her romance novels and fashion magazines. Even the scent of the house was different, heavy with perfumes and candles I would never have chosen. The kitchen revealed more evidence of Ashley's occupation. My grandmother's china had been moved to make room for her casual dinnerware. The refrigerator was covered with notes and photos documenting her relationship with Marcus, including several taken in what had clearly been my bed. The casual cruelty of displaying these intimate moments in my own kitchen spoke to a level of disrespect that went beyond simple adultery. I moved methodically through each room, the recording device capturing both my observations and the evidence of their systematic appropriation of my life. In the master bedroom, I found Ashley asleep, in my bed, wearing one of my military t-shirts as pajamas. The sight triggered a surge of rage that I carefully controlled, channeling it into the focused determination that had served me well in combat. Ashley's presence created a tactical complication I hadn't anticipated. Confronting her while she was alone could be emotionally satisfying, but it would also alert her and Marcus to my return before I was ready for the full confrontation. Instead, I decided to use her unconscious presence as an opportunity to gather additional intelligence. Her laptop was open on the nightstand, still connected to social media accounts where she'd been documenting what she called her new beginning. The posts revealed details about their future plans that even David's surveillance hadn't captured. Ashley had been researching international wedding destinations and posting about starting fresh in paradise with my soulmate. She'd also been corresponding with real estate agents in Central America, looking at properties that cost far more than she could afford on her salon worker's salary. But the most damaging evidence was in her private messages with friends, where she'd bragged about taking everything that military bitch thinks she owns, and described me as too stupid to realize what was happening while she was playing soldier in the desert. The messages revealed that this wasn't just an affair that had gotten out of hand, but a calculated campaign to defraud me of my assets while I was serving overseas. I photographed every relevant message and post, building a comprehensive record of their intentions and activities. Ashley's own words would provide powerful evidence of premeditation and malicious intent when this situation reached legal proceedings. Moving to Marcus's home office, I found evidence that was even more damning. His computer was password protected, but military intelligence training had taught me techniques for accessing secured systems. What I discovered confirmed David's analysis and revealed additional layers of deception I hadn't anticipated. Marcus had been methodically researching my military service, looking for ways to characterize my deployment as abandonment of our marriage. He'd consulted with divorce attorneys about claiming desertion, despite the fact that military deployment is legally protected activity. More troubling, he'd been in contact with investigators who specialized in challenging military benefits and survivor rights. The email correspondence revealed that Marcus had been planning this betrayal since before my deployment began. He'd used my preparation time and deployment announcement as opportunities to begin liquidating assets and establishing the financial infrastructure for his new life with Ashley. The timing hadn't been coincidental. It had been strategically calculated to maximize his advantage while minimizing my ability to respond. But Marcus's research had also revealed a critical gap in his intelligence. He'd been so focused on our joint assets and my military benefits that he'd never investigated my family background or independent financial resources. The trust fund that my grandfather had established remained completely invisible to his planning, which meant he had no idea of the legal and financial resources I could bring to bear against him. I spent 2 hours gathering evidence and documenting the changes to my home before calling Eleanor Washington. The attorney answered immediately, her voice professional but warm with concern. "Captain Chen, I'm so sorry you're dealing with this situation while transitioning home from deployment," she said. "But I want you to know that we have excellent grounds for both civil and criminal prosecution. Your husband's actions constitute several felonies under Virginia law." Eleanor's firm had been reviewing the evidence that David had gathered, and their analysis was thorough and encouraging. Marcus's financial manipulations violated multiple statutes related to fraud and theft. His misrepresentation of marital status on legal documents constituted wire fraud. Most importantly, his attempts to claim abandoned property rights while I was deployed violated federal laws protecting military families. "We're prepared to file comprehensive legal actions as soon as you give us authorization," Eleanor continued. "But I want to discuss strategy options with you. We can pursue immediate injunctive relief to freeze all assets and force him to account for every transaction. We can also coordinate with federal prosecutors to pursue criminal charges. The question is how aggressively you want to proceed." I considered the options carefully, weighing legal strategy against personal satisfaction and long-term consequences. Military training had taught me that the most effective operations achieve maximum objectives with minimum collateral damage. I want to give him one opportunity to resolve this honorably, I decided. Present him with complete evidence of his crimes and offer negotiated settlement terms. If he refuses or attempts to escalate, then we pursue maximum legal consequences. Eleanor approved of this approach. That demonstrates good faith on your part and provides legal protection if he claims you were vindictive or unreasonable. We'll prepare settlement terms that protect your interests while giving him a face-saving exit strategy. After ending the call with Eleanor, I contacted Colonel Martinez to report my safe arrival and request additional leave time to resolve the family emergency. My commanding officer was understanding and supportive, reminding me that the military community took care of its own and that resources were available if I needed them. "Don't let anyone take advantage of your service, Captain," she said firmly. "You've earned respect and protection through your sacrifice. Make sure you get both." David returned to the house with additional surveillance equipment and updates on Marcus's activities. My husband had spent the morning at his law office, apparently conducting normal business, while unaware that his world was about to change dramatically. "He's scheduled to leave the office at 17:30 hours, David reported. Ashley has been texting him about dinner plans and discussing their evening together. They're completely unaware that you're home. I used the remaining hours to prepare the confrontation with military precision. Eleanor Washington's firm had overnight delivered a complete legal packet that included injunction papers, asset freeze orders, and criminal referral documentation. David had compiled a comprehensive evidence folder with financial records, surveillance photographs, and communication intercepts. I had prepared a timeline of Marcus's activities and a detailed settlement offer that would provide him with an alternative to public humiliation and criminal prosecution. The plan was straightforward. Present Marcus with complete evidence of his crimes, explain the legal consequences he was facing, and offer him negotiated terms that would end the situation without destroying his career or sending him to prison. If he accepted responsibility and agreed to fair asset division, I would pursue civil remedies rather than criminal charges. If he chose to fight or continued his deceptive behavior, I would use every legal weapon available to destroy him financially and professionally. At 1700 hours, I positioned myself in the living room where Marcus would enter the house. Ashley was still sleeping upstairs, unaware that her comfortable appropriation of my life was about to end. David was stationed outside with recording equipment to capture any threats or attempts at intimidation Marcus might make. I had changed from my military uniform into civilian clothes, but I made sure to wear my deployment medals and unit insignia. I wanted Marcus to be reminded immediately that he was confronting someone who had served with honor while he was betraying his marriage vows and committing crimes. At 1743 hours, I heard Marcus's car in the driveway. Through the window, I watched him gather his briefcase and walk toward the front door with the casual confidence of someone who believed he had successfully orchestrated a perfect crime. He was about to discover that his victim had returned from war with resources and capabilities he had never imagined. The key turned in the lock, and Marcus stepped into what he believed was his house, ready to continue his new life with Ashley. Instead, he found himself face to face with the wife he had tried to discard, armed with evidence of his crimes and prepared for the kind of battle he was completely unequipped to fight. "Hello, Marcus," I said calmly, gesturing toward the chair across from me. "We need to talk." His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, fear, and finally anger as he processed my unexpected presence. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be deployed for another month." "Emergency leave," I replied evenly. "Family crisis. I'm sure you understand." Marcus set down his briefcase and moved toward the stairs, probably intending to warn Ashley or perhaps to retrieve something from his office. I stopped him with a simple gesture toward the evidence folders arranged on the coffee table. "Before you go anywhere, you need to see these documents," I said, my voice carrying the authority that had commanded soldiers in combat zones. "They contain evidence of crimes you've committed over the past 6 months. Crimes that carry federal prison sentences." Marcus's expression shifted to defensive aggression, the response of someone who had been caught but wasn't ready to admit guilt. "I don't know what you think you've discovered, but this is still my house and you can't intimidate me with military theatrics." I opened the first folder and began laying out photographs of his financial transactions, copies of fraudulent documents he'd signed, and records of assets he'd stolen while I was deployed. Each piece of evidence was carefully organized and annotated, building an irrefutable case of systematic fraud and theft. "Wire fraud," I said, placing the apartment lease documents in front of him. "Theft by conversion, misrepresentation on legal documents." Each of these charges carries up to 10 years in federal prison, Marcus. Combined, you're looking at potential sentences that would end your legal career and destroy your life. Marcus examined the documents with growing alarm, his attorney training allowing him to recognize the severity of the evidence I'd assembled. His face had gone pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he realized the extent of his exposure. "This is entrapment," he said weakly. "You can't prove intent." I opened the second folder, revealing Ashley's social media posts and private messages where she'd bragged about defrauding me. "Your girlfriend documented everything, Marcus. She's been posting about stealing my life and mocking my military service. Intent is clearly established." The third folder contained David's surveillance reports, showing their activities and communications over the past month. Marcus stared at the photographs of himself and Ashley at restaurants and hotels. Evidence of the lifestyle they'd been funding with stolen assets. "You've been watching us," he said, but the accusation lacked conviction. He was beginning to understand that his careful planning had been matched by superior intelligence gathering and legal preparation. I leaned forward, maintaining eye contact. With the intensity that had intimidated insurgents and earned respect from fellow soldiers. "You made a critical error, Marcus. You assumed that my military service made me vulnerable and powerless. Instead, it gave me skills and resources you never suspected. You picked a fight with someone trained to win wars." From upstairs came the sound of Ashley stirring, probably awakened by our voices. Marcus glanced toward the stairs, clearly considering his options. I could see him calculating whether to deny everything, attempt to negotiate, or double down on aggression. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice defeated. I opened the final folder, revealing the settlement terms that Eleanor Washington had prepared. "I want justice. I want compensation for the assets you stole. I want accountability for the pain you've caused. And I want assurance that you'll never again underestimate the woman you married." The settlement terms were comprehensive but fair. Marcus would return all stolen assets with interest, compensate me for legal expenses and emotional damages, and accept responsibility for his actions in a sworn statement. In exchange, I would pursue civil rather than criminal remedies, allowing him to keep his law license and avoid federal prison. "If you refuse these terms," I continued, "I will pursue maximum criminal penalties. You'll face federal charges for wire fraud. Your law partner Jackson will be investigated for ethics violations, and every detail of your betrayal will become public record during the trial." Marcus studied the settlement documents, his legal training allowing him to understand both the fairness of the terms and the catastrophic consequences of rejection. Ashley's footsteps could be heard on the stairs as she descended to investigate, the voices below. When she appeared in the doorway, wearing my military t-shirt and showing no shame at being discovered in my home, the final confrontation of this carefully planned operation was about to begin. But I was ready for whatever came next, armed with truth, protected by law, and backed by the unshakable confidence that comes from serving with honor, while others choose deception and betrayal. The war Marcus had started with a text message was about to end on my terms, in my house, with justice finally being served. Ashley descended the stairs with the casual confidence of someone who believed she owned the space she occupied. Her blonde hair was tousled from sleep, and she moved with the lazy satisfaction of a cat claiming territory. When she spotted me, sitting across from Marcus, her expression shifted from sleepy confusion to sharp recognition, then to something approaching panic. "What is she doing here?" Ashley demanded, looking between Marcus and me as if I were an intruder in my own home. "I thought you said she wasn't coming back for weeks." Marcus's face had gone ashen as he continued studying the evidence folders I'd laid before him. He seemed incapable of speech, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his legal exposure. Ashley, however, showed no such restraint. "This is harassment," she declared, moving to stand beside Marcus with protective possessiveness. "You can't just show up here and terrorize us with your military intimidation tactics. We have rights." I regarded her with the same detached professionalism I'd used when interrogating suspected insurgents in Afghanistan. Ashley's bravado was impressive, but it couldn't mask the fear I could see building behind her eyes as she began to understand that her comfortable appropriation of my life was ending. "You're wearing my shirt," I observed calmly, gesturing toward the Army unit insignia on the garment she'd chosen as sleepwear. "That's actually a federal crime, Ashley. Unauthorized wear of military uniforms or insignia carries serious penalties." Ashley's hand moved instinctively to cover the unit patch, her defiance wavering as she realized that even her choice of clothing had legal implications she hadn't considered. Marcus finally found his voice, though it carried none of the confident authority he typically projected in professional settings. "Sarah, we need to discuss this reasonably. There's no need for threats or legal posturing. We're all adults here." "Adults don't commit wire fraud while their spouses are deployed in combat zones," I replied, opening another evidence folder. "Adults don't forge documents to steal assets or lie to landlords about their marital status. What you've done isn't an affair, Marcus. It's organized crime." I handed Ashley a copy of her own social media posts, the ones where she'd bragged about taking everything I owned and mocked my military service. Her face flushed as she read her own words, apparently realizing for the first time how damaging her online commentary would appear to judges and juries. "I was just venting," she said weakly. "People say things online they don't really mean." "People also document their criminal intentions online," I countered, retrieving my phone to display additional screenshots. "Conspiracy requires proof of planning and intent. You've provided both in remarkable detail." Ashley turned to Marcus for support, but he was absorbed in reviewing the settlement terms Eleanor Washington had prepared. His legal training allowed him to recognize both the comprehensiveness of the evidence against him and the relative generosity of the resolution I was offering. "These terms are actually reasonable," he admitted reluctantly, "given the alternative consequences." Ashley's expression shifted to incredulity as she realized Marcus was considering capitulation rather than fighting. "You're not seriously thinking about giving in to her demands? She's bluffing, Marcus. What's she going to do, attack us? She's just a soldier." I felt a cold smile cross my face at Ashley's dismissive assessment. Just a soldier who had commanded combat operations, managed multi-million-dollar equipment budgets, and led teams through life-or-death situations. Just a soldier who had earned advanced degrees, maintained security clearances, and developed expertise in areas Ashley couldn't comprehend. "Actually," I said, reaching for my phone, "let me show you what this soldier is going to do." I dialed Eleanor Washington's direct number, putting the call on speaker so both Marcus and Ashley could hear the conversation that would determine their immediate future. "Captain Chen," Eleanor answered promptly. "Are you ready to proceed with the legal filings?" "That depends on their response to the settlement offer," I replied, watching Marcus and Ashley's expressions as they realized this conversation was being monitored by attorney. "They're reviewing the terms now." Eleanor's voice carried the professional authority of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. "Please remind them that the settlement window closes at midnight tonight. After that point, we'll proceed with both civil and criminal filings. The federal prosecutor's office has already reviewed the evidence and confirmed they're prepared to pursue charges." Ashley's face went pale as the reality of federal prosecution began to penetrate her defiance. Marcus was studying the settlement documents more intently, his attorney training allowing him to understand the escalating legal timeline. "What specific charges are we discussing?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully controlled. Eleanor's response was crisp and comprehensive. "Wire fraud, theft by conversion, identity theft, falsification of legal documents, and conspiracy. Combined sentences could range from 15 to 25 years in federal prison. Additionally, civil restitution could exceed $200,000 when you factor in punitive damages and legal expenses." The silence that followed was broken only by Ashley's sharp intake of breath. The comfortable life she'd been building with stolen assets was crumbling before her eyes, replaced by the prospect of criminal prosecution and financial ruin. "I need to consult with my attorney," Marcus said finally. "Of course," Eleanor replied. "But remember that time is limited. Captain Chen is being extraordinarily generous in offering settlement rather than immediate prosecution. That generosity expires at midnight." After ending the call, I gathered the evidence folders and stood to leave. Marcus and Ashley watched me with growing desperation as they realized I was departing without resolving the situation. "Where are you going?" Ashley demanded. "We need to talk about this." "You have 8 hours to decide," I replied, checking my watch. "Accept responsibility and make restitution, or face the consequences of your actions in federal court. Your choice." I walked toward the door, leaving them alone with the evidence of their crimes and the settlement terms that represented their only escape from prosecution. David was waiting in his vehicle outside, monitoring communications and ready to respond if the situation escalated. "How did it go?" he asked as I climbed into the passenger seat. "They're scared," I reported. "But not broken yet. Marcus understands the legal exposure, but Ashley is still pushing him to fight. We need to be prepared for them to make poor decisions." David nodded, starting the engine. "Where to now?" "Hotel," I decided. "I want them to have the house tonight to discuss their options without feeling pressured. Sometimes people make better decisions when they think they have privacy to panic." We drove to a downtown Richmond hotel where David had reserved a suite equipped with the communication monitoring equipment his investigation work required. Over room service dinner, we reviewed the intelligence he'd gathered about Marcus's law, partner Jackson, and discussed contingency plans for various scenarios. "Jackson's been trying to distance himself from the situation," David reported, showing me intercepted communications. "He's realized the ethical exposure and potential criminal liability. Marcus won't be getting much support from his law firm." The intelligence was encouraging but not decisive. Desperate people often made irrational choices, and I needed to be prepared for Marcus and Ashley to escalate rather than surrender. My phone rang at 2147 hours. Marcus's name appeared on the display, indicating he was ready to begin negotiations. "I've spoken with my attorney," he said without preamble. "He advises me to take the settlement." "Smart attorney," I replied. "Are you prepared to execute the documents tonight?" There was a pause before Marcus responded. "Ashley wants to negotiate terms. She thinks some of the restitution demands are excessive." I felt my patience wearing thin. Ashley had no legal standing in this matter, no assets at risk, and no authority to negotiate anything. Her continued interference suggested she didn't understand the gravity of their situation. "Ashley isn't party to this settlement," I said firmly. "She can accept the terms offered or face prosecution for her own crimes. Those are her only options." "She's upset," Marcus explained weakly. "She thinks you're being vindictive." "Marcus," I said, my voice carrying the steel that had commanded respect in combat zones, "you have 2 hours to present me with signed settlement documents. If you choose to let Ashley sabotage your opportunity to avoid federal prison, that's your decision. But this offer expires whether you've made up your mind or not." I ended the call and turned to David, who had been monitoring the conversation. "They're going to try to negotiate down the terms. Ashley doesn't understand that she has no leverage." David's expression was grim. "People in desperate situations sometimes convince themselves they have options they don't actually possess. Are you prepared to follow through with prosecution if they refuse?" I considered the question honestly. Part of me wanted Marcus to reject the settlement, to force the situation into public court proceedings where his betrayal and crimes would be thoroughly documented. But military training had taught me that the most successful operations achieved objectives with minimum necessary force. "I'd prefer resolution to warfare," I admitted. "But if they choose warfare, I'm prepared to win it." At 22:30 hours, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was from Ashley, apparently using a friend's phone to circumvent any communication monitoring. "This is all a misunderstanding," the message read. "Marcus and I fell in love. That's not a crime. We can work this out like adults without lawyers and threats." I showed the message to David, who shook his head in disbelief. "She still doesn't understand that love doesn't excuse fraud and theft. This is exactly the kind of thinking that's going to land them in federal prison." I decided not to respond to Ashley's message. Any communication would only encourage her belief that negotiation was possible and delay the resolution that needed to occur. At 23:47 hours, 13 minutes before the settlement deadline, Marcus called again. This time his voice carried the defeated tone of someone who had finally accepted reality. "We'll take the settlement," he said. "All terms as written. No modifications." "Excellent," I replied, already reaching for the documents Eleanor Washington had prepared. "Meet me at Eleanor's office at 0900 tomorrow morning. Bring cashier's checks for the full restitution amount and be prepared to execute all settlement documents." "What about Ashley?" Marcus asked. "What about her?" "She's worried about her own legal exposure. Will she need separate representation?" I considered this question carefully. Ashley's crimes were serious, but they were largely derivative of Marcus's planning and execution. Pursuing her separately would be vindictive without serving justice. If she complies with asset return and stays away from me permanently, I won't pursue separate charges, I decided. But if she interferes with settlement execution or attempts any retaliation, all bets are off. The next morning, I arrived at Eleanor Washington's law office prepared for final resolution of the nightmare Marcus had created with his deployment betrayal. The building was a converted Victorian mansion in Richmond's legal district, its elegant architecture projecting the kind of established respectability that came with generations of successful practice. Eleanor met me in the reception area, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her expression radiating the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to winning difficult cases. "Good morning, Captain Chen. Are you ready to close this chapter of your life?" "More than ready," I confirmed, following her toward the conference room where Marcus would face the consequences of his actions. Marcus arrived exactly on time, accompanied by a criminal defense attorney I didn't recognize. He looked as though he hadn't slept, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled and his normally confident bearing replaced by nervous energy. "Where's Ashley?" I asked, noting her absence. "She decided not to come," Marcus replied. "She's processing everything." Eleanor's paralegal distributed settlement documents while I reviewed the cashier's checks Marcus had brought. The amounts were correct, covering full restitution plus interest and legal expenses. The documentation was comprehensive, including sworn statements acknowledging his crimes and accepting responsibility for his actions. "Before we proceed," Eleanor said, addressing Marcus directly, "I want to ensure you understand that this settlement includes permanent admissions of wrongdoing. If you violate any terms, criminal prosecution will proceed based on your signed confessions." Marcus nodded, his attorney advising him to proceed with execution. The signing process took 45 minutes, with each document carefully reviewed and witnessed. When the final page was initialed, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. "It's finished," Eleanor announced. "Captain Chen, you now have full control of all marital assets and clear title to all property. Mr. Mitchell, you have 48 hours to remove your personal belongings from the residence." As Marcus and his attorney prepared to leave, I made a decision that surprised even myself. "Marcus," I called, stopping him at the conference room door. He turned back with apprehension, probably expecting final retribution or humiliation. "I hope you learned something from this," I said simply. "About honor, about consequences, about the value of the person you betrayed." Marcus studied my face for a long moment, perhaps looking for the vindictive anger he expected to find. Instead, he saw only the professional composure of someone who had achieved justice without compromising her own integrity. "I underestimated you," he said quietly, "completely and catastrophically." "Yes," I agreed. "You did." After Marcus departed, Eleanor and I reviewed the final settlement terms and discussed ongoing legal protections. The documentation would prevent any future claims against my assets, while ensuring that Marcus couldn't profit from his crimes through book deals, interviews, or other exploitation of the situation. "What are your plans now?" Eleanor asked as we concluded our business. I considered the question thoughtfully. Healing, I decided, and making sure this never happens to another military family. Over the following weeks, I learned that justice, while satisfying, wasn't the same as closure. Marcus had returned all stolen assets and admitted his crimes, but the emotional damage of his betrayal required different kinds of repair. Ashley had apparently left Richmond immediately after the settlement, moving back to her hometown in Ohio and deleting all social media accounts. According to David's sources, she had told friends that she'd been manipulated by a controlling man and was starting over fresh. The revisionist narrative was predictable but no longer my concern. Marcus had resigned from his law firm to avoid the ethical investigation that his criminal admissions would have triggered. He'd moved to a small apartment across town and was reportedly working as a paralegal while contemplating career alternatives that didn't require bar admission. The house felt different after his belongings were removed. Not just emptier, but cleaner somehow, as if removing his possessions had also eliminated the residual toxicity of his betrayal. I spent several days reclaiming the space, restoring furniture arrangements and replacing items that Ashley had damaged or discarded. But the most significant change was internal. The hypervigilance that military service had instilled was no longer needed for survival in my own home. The careful documentation and strategic planning that had protected me from Marcus's betrayal could be redirected toward positive goals rather than defensive measures. 3 weeks after the settlement, I received an unexpected visitor. Colonel Martinez had driven down from Fort Bragg to check on my recovery and discuss my future with the Army. "You've been through hell, Captain," she said as we sat in my reclaimed living room. "But you've handled it with remarkable professionalism. The Army could use more officers who demonstrate that kind of resilience under pressure." We discussed my career trajectory and the possibility of specializing in legal affairs or military family advocacy. My experience with deployment betrayal had given me insights that could help other military families protect themselves from similar situations. "Consider it," Colonel Martinez suggested. "Your combination of legal knowledge, military experience, and personal understanding of these issues could make you incredibly effective as an advocate." The suggestion resonated with something deeper than career advancement. Marcus's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also revealed systemic vulnerabilities that affected military families throughout the armed forces. If my experience could prevent other service members from facing similar betrayals, then perhaps some meaning could be salvaged from the pain. That evening, I called Eleanor Washington to discuss the possibility of establishing a legal clinic, specifically focused on protecting deployed military personnel from financial and domestic exploitation. "It's a brilliant idea," Eleanor said enthusiastically. "Military families face unique vulnerabilities that civilian attorneys often don't understand. Your experience would provide credibility and insight that could revolutionize how these cases are handled." As spring turned to summer, I began developing a comprehensive program that would combine legal education, financial protection, and advocacy services for military families. The initiative would include pre-deployment planning, asset protection strategies, and rapid response capabilities for families facing exploitation while deployed. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying, providing purpose that transcended my personal situation. Marcus had intended his betrayal to diminish my life and limit my future. Instead, it had catalyzed a mission that would help thousands of military families protect themselves from similar predators. 6 months after receiving Marcus's text message in Afghanistan, I stood before a congressional subcommittee discussing proposed legislation to strengthen legal protections for deployed military personnel. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's attempt to destroy my life had instead elevated me to a platform where I could influence national policy. "Military families make extraordinary sacrifices in service to our nation," I testified. "They deserve comprehensive protection from those who would exploit their service for personal gain." The legislation before you today would ensure that no service member faces the choice between military duty and protecting their family from domestic predators. The committee's response was overwhelmingly positive, with several members sharing stories of similar betrayals in their own districts. The legislation would eventually pass with bipartisan support, creating the strongest protections in American history for deployed military families. Marcus's betrayal had been intended as an ending. Instead, it had become a beginning, launching me toward a future more meaningful and impactful than anything I could have imagined while serving in Afghanistan. The text message that was meant to destroy me had instead liberated me to become the person I was always meant to be. 2 years after Marcus's devastating text message had shattered my world in an Afghan forward operating base, I stood at the podium of the Pentagon's main auditorium, addressing an audience of senior military leadership, congressional representatives, and advocacy organization directors. The woman speaking to this distinguished assembly bore little resemblance to the broken soldier who had once sat in the dust of Kandahar, staring at her phone in disbelief. The Deployed Family Protection Act has fundamentally transformed how our military addresses domestic exploitation, I announced to the packed auditorium. In its first year of implementation, we've prevented over 300 cases of financial fraud against deployed service members and prosecuted 47 individuals for crimes targeting military families. The applause that followed carried a weight of recognition that went far beyond professional courtesy. These were people who understood the magnitude of what had been accomplished. The systemic change that had emerged from personal tragedy transformed into purposeful action. General Patricia Morrison, the Army's highest-ranking female officer, approached the podium after my presentation concluded. Captain Chen, your advocacy work has created the most comprehensive protective framework for military families in our nation's history. The Department of Defense would like to discuss expanding your role to oversee implementation across all service branches. The offer represented a career trajectory I could never have imagined while enduring Marcus's betrayal. From the ashes of personal devastation, I had built not just a new life, but a new mission that was reshaping how America protected its military families. The journey to this moment had been neither easy nor straightforward. After the congressional testimony that led to landmark legislation, I had spent 18 months developing the infrastructure to support its implementation. The work required expertise in military law, family psychology, financial planning, and victim advocacy, skills I had accumulated through necessity but refined through dedication. The National Military Family Security Institute had grown from a concept born of personal experience into a fully operational organization with offices in 12 states and partnerships with legal aid societies nationwide. Our rapid response: teams could be deployed within hours to assist military families facing exploitation, providing legal representation, financial counseling, and emotional support services. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of the work was the prevention program we had developed for pre-deployment families. Military couples now received comprehensive education about protecting their assets, recognizing warning signs of domestic exploitation, and accessing immediate help when problems arose. The program had been mandatory for all deploying personnel since the legislation passed, ensuring that no service member would face the isolation and vulnerability I had experienced. The personal cost of this transformation had been significant. Building a national advocacy organization while processing the trauma of betrayal required a kind of compartmentalization that sometimes felt emotionally exhausting. There were nights when the weight of other families' stories combined with my own unresolved grief to create a loneliness that success couldn't cure. But there had also been unexpected rewards. The military community had embraced me with a warmth and respect that felt like coming home to a family I hadn't known I needed. Senior officers sought my counsel on family policy issues. Congressional representatives requested my input on veteran affairs legislation. Most importantly, service members facing crises knew they could reach out for help without judgment or bureaucratic obstacles. The personal healing had been slower than the professional advancement. Trust, once shattered by intimate betrayal, required careful reconstruction through relationships that proved themselves over time. There had been tentative romantic connections that hadn't developed into lasting partnerships, partly because of my demanding schedule, but mainly because I had become more selective about the character of people I allowed into my inner circle. The financial settlement from Marcus had provided a foundation for independence, but it was the trust fund from my grandfather that had funded the advocacy organization's startup costs. The irony was perfect. Family wealth I had never mentioned to Marcus became the seed money for protecting other families from the kind of exploitation he had attempted. Colonel Martinez, who had become both mentor and friend, often reminded me that my grandfather would be proud of how his legacy was being used. He understood military service, she had said during one of our regular dinners. He would appreciate that his investment in your future became an investment in protecting all military families. The transformation extended beyond professional accomplishments to personal identity. The woman who had once accommodated Marcus's need to be the dominant partner in our relationship had evolved into someone comfortable with authority and recognition. I no longer minimized my achievements or deflected credit to make others more comfortable. The military had taught me about leadership, but Marcus's betrayal had taught me about my own strength. Media attention had been an unexpected aspect of the advocacy work. The story of a deployed soldier whose husband's betrayal led to landmark family protection legislation resonated with audiences far beyond the military community. I had been featured in major news publications, appeared on national television programs, and been profiled in military magazines as an example of resilience and purpose-driven leadership. The attention was sometimes uncomfortable for someone trained in operational security and military discretion, but it served the mission of raising awareness about military family vulnerabilities. Every interview was an opportunity to educate civilian audiences about the sacrifices military families made and the protections they deserved. Marcus had vanished from my awareness after the settlement, disappearing into the kind of anonymity that people sought when their reputation had been destroyed by their own actions. I occasionally heard fragments of information through mutual acquaintances. He was working for a small firm in another state, maintaining a low profile, apparently having learned harsh lessons about the consequences of betraying people with resources and determination. Ashley had similarly faded into irrelevance, becoming a cautionary tale rather than a source of active anger. David's investigative contacts reported that she had struggled to find stable employment after potential employers discovered her social media history documenting fraud and betrayal. The internet had preserved her bragging about stealing from a deployed soldier, creating a permanent record that followed her across state lines and career changes. But the most satisfying aspect of my transformation wasn't their downfall. It was my own elevation. The text message that Marcus had intended to devastate me had instead catalyzed the most meaningful period of my life. His attempt to diminish my worth had forced me to discover capabilities and purpose I might never have developed otherwise. General Morrison's offer to oversee military family protection across all service branches represented the culmination of everything I had built. From the wreckage of my marriage, the position would require relocating to Washington, D.C., expanding the advocacy programs nationally, and working directly with Pentagon leadership to implement systemic reforms. "I accept," I told General Morrison after considering the implications. "But I want to maintain direct contact with field operations. The work loses meaning if it becomes purely administrative." 3 months later, I stood in my new Pentagon office, reviewing implementation reports from military bases worldwide. The scope of impact was staggering. Thousands of military families now had protections that hadn't existed when Marcus sent his betrayal text from halfway around the world. Financial exploitation cases had decreased by 60%. Legal prosecution of domestic predators had increased dramatically. Most importantly, military families knew they had advocates who understood their unique challenges. The office walls, displayed awards and commendations that documented my unlikely journey from betrayed spouse to national advocate. But the item I treasured most was a framed letter from a young Marine wife whose deployment fraud case had been resolved within 48 hours of her reaching out for help. "You saved my family," she had written. "My husband was in Iraq when his brother tried to steal our house. Your rapid response team stopped him before we lost everything. Thank you for turning your pain into our protection." That letter captured the essence of what I had accomplished. Marcus's cruelty had been transformed into compassion for others. His betrayal had become the foundation for protecting thousands of military families from similar predators. His attempt to destroy my life had instead equipped me to save others from the devastation he had tried to inflict. The Pentagon assignment also brought unexpected personal developments. Working alongside dedicated military and civilian professionals who shared my commitment to family protection created opportunities for relationships based on mutual respect and common purpose. I had begun dating Dr. Michael Harrison, a military psychologist who specialized in deployment stress and family dynamics. His understanding of both military culture and emotional trauma made conversations flow naturally between professional collaboration and personal connection. Michael's approach to our relationship reflected the lessons I had learned about character and integrity. He was transparent about his background, consistent in his actions, and respectful of my independence and achievements. Unlike Marcus, who had seen my military service as competition for his ego, Michael viewed my career as something that enhanced rather than threatened our partnership. "You've created something remarkable," he said during a quiet dinner at his apartment overlooking the Potomac River. "Not just the advocacy organization, but the model of how personal trauma can be transformed into societal benefit. That takes extraordinary courage." His words carried weight because they came from someone who understood the psychology of resilience and post-traumatic growth. Military families often face challenges that would devastate civilian relationships, but they also developed strengths that enabled remarkable recoveries and achievements. The relationship was progressing carefully, without the urgency that had characterized my courtship with Marcus. Experience had taught me the value of patience in assessing character and compatibility. Michael's consistency over months of professional and personal interaction had earned trust that I no longer granted easily or quickly. 5 years after receiving Marcus's text message in Afghanistan, I was invited to deliver the keynote address at the Army War College's annual leadership symposium. The theme was Adaptive Leadership in Crisis, and my presentation would focus on how personal adversity could be leveraged to create systemic improvements. Standing before an auditorium, filled with senior military officers, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The naive young woman who had married Marcus believing that love would overcome all obstacles had evolved into someone who understood that true strength came from confronting reality rather than avoiding it. Leadership is often forged in moments of crisis, I told the assembled officers. Not the dramatic crises we train for in war games and exercises, but the personal betrayals and intimate challenges that test our character when we think no one is watching. I shared strategic insights rather than personal details, focusing on the leadership principles that had enabled my transformation from victim to advocate. The audience responded with the kind of engaged attention that indicated professional recognition and respect. After the presentation, Colonel Martinez, now serving as the War College's deputy commandant, approached with visible pride. "Your grandfather would be amazed by what you've accomplished," she said. "From graduate school algorithm to military family protection, you've created a legacy that will outlast all of us." The evening reception brought introductions to military leaders from around the world, many of whom had implemented versions of the family protection protocols I had developed. A British Army colonel mentioned that their deployment procedures now included safeguards modeled after American innovations. An Australian general discussed adapting our rapid response systems for their smaller military structure. The global impact of work that had begun with personal betrayal in an Afghan outpost was both humbling and energizing. Marcus's text message had triggered changes that were now protecting military families on multiple continents. During the reception, I received a message from David, who had continued his investigation work while occasionally consulting on military family protection cases. "Thought you'd want to know," his text read. "Marcus filed for bankruptcy last month. Apparently his new law practice isn't going well." I read the message without emotional reaction. Marcus's current difficulties were the natural consequences of his choices, not something I had caused or needed to concern myself with. The woman who might once have felt guilty about his struggles had evolved into someone who understood that accountability wasn't cruelty. The final recognition of my transformation came unexpectedly through a phone call from the White House military office. The president wanted to present me with the Presidential Citizens Medal for exceptional service to military families. The ceremony would take place in the Rose Garden, with representatives from all service branches and advocacy organizations in attendance. Standing in the Rose Garden on a crisp October morning, listening to the president describe my work as an extraordinary example of how personal courage can create lasting institutional change, I thought about the trajectory that had brought me to this moment. Marcus's betrayal had been intended to diminish my life and limit my future. Instead, it had liberated me to become someone I could never have imagined while accommodating his ego and insecurities. The medal ceremony was attended by military families from across the country, many of whom had been helped by the protective systems we had created. Their presence reminded me that this recognition wasn't about personal achievement, but about collective progress toward ensuring that military service didn't make families vulnerable to domestic predators. After the ceremony, I stood alone for a moment in the Rose Garden, holding the medal and processing the magnitude of what had been accomplished. The young captain who had received Marcus's cruel text message in Afghanistan could never have envisioned this moment. But perhaps that was the point. Growth required venturing into territory that seemed impossible from the starting point. My phone buzzed with a message from Michael, who had watched the ceremony from the White House lawn. "Dinner tonight to celebrate? I have something I'd like to discuss with you." The message carried implications that made me smile. Michael's careful approach to our relationship suggested that any discussion he wanted to have would be thoroughly considered and thoughtfully presented. The contrast with Marcus's impulsive and selfish decision-making was striking. That evening, over dinner at a quiet restaurant in Georgetown, Michael presented me with a small velvet box and a proposal that reflected everything I had learned about healthy partnership. He had prepared a speech that acknowledged my independence, respected my career commitments, and offered partnership rather than possession. "I want to build something together," he said simply. "Not because either of us needs completion, but because we've both experienced enough to recognize what's worth building." I accepted his proposal with the confidence of someone who had learned to distinguish between genuine love and manipulative performance. The engagement ring he slipped onto my finger was beautiful but understated, chosen with consideration for my preferences rather than his desire to impress others. 6 months later, we were married in a small ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery, surrounded by military colleagues and family members who had supported my journey from betrayal to triumph. Colonel Martinez officiated the ceremony, using her chaplain credentials to unite two people who had found each other through shared dedication to military families. The setting was deliberately meaningful. Arlington represented sacrifice and service, values that would foundation our marriage rather than the ego and ambition that had destroyed my relationship with Marcus. Michael and I exchanged vows that emphasized partnership, mutual support, and shared commitment to work that mattered more than personal comfort. As we stood together at the altar, I thought briefly about the woman I had been when Marcus's text message arrived in Afghanistan. She had been vulnerable because she had trusted without verification, loved without boundaries, and sacrificed without ensuring reciprocity. The woman I had become understood that true strength came from clear-eyed assessment of reality and unwavering commitment to principles. The reception was held at the Army-Navy Club, a venue that honored military tradition while celebrating new beginnings. David gave a toast that captured the transformation perfectly. To Sarah, who proved that the best revenge isn't getting even, it's becoming someone your enemies could never have imagined you could be. The guests included military families, whose lives had been improved by the advocacy work, congressional representatives who had supported protective legislation, and Pentagon officials who had implemented systemic reforms. Their presence reminded me that personal healing and professional achievement had merged into something larger than either could have been separately. Later that evening, as Michael and I danced to music that celebrated love rather than possession, I reflected on the journey that had brought us together. Marcus's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been educational. It had taught me about my own resilience, revealed capabilities I hadn't known I possessed, and clarified values that would guide future decisions. The woman Marcus had tried to discard had become someone who protected thousands of military families from predators like him. The career he had dismissed as irrelevant to real relationships had evolved into national leadership that influenced policy at the highest levels. The independence he had resented had become the foundation for partnerships based on mutual respect, rather than dominance. 2 years into our marriage, Michael and I purchased a home in Arlington, a restored colonial that provided space for both our professional work and personal life. The house was chosen for its character and functionality, rather than prestige or impression, reflecting values that prioritized substance over appearance. The home office I established there became the nerve center for military family advocacy work that now spanned international partnerships and influenced policy development worldwide. The walls displayed commendations and awards that documented achievements I could never have imagined while sitting in that Afghan outpost, reading Marcus's dismissive text message. But the item I treasured most wasn't an award or commendation. It was a framed photograph of my grandfather in his World War II uniform, standing beside the original deed for the first property he had purchased after returning from overseas service. His investment in my future had become investment in protecting all military families, creating a legacy that honored both his sacrifice and my service. On quiet evenings, when the advocacy work was set aside and domestic peace settled over our home, I sometimes reflected on the trajectory that had brought me to this life. Marcus's cruelty had been intended to break me, to force me into a diminished version of myself that would accept whatever scraps of dignity he chose to leave behind. Instead, his betrayal had forced me to discover strength I hadn't known I possessed, purpose I had never imagined, and love based on respect rather than control. The text message he had sent to end my story had actually begun the most meaningful chapter of my life. 7 years after receiving that devastating message in Afghanistan, I stood once again before a congressional committee, this time testifying about international cooperation in protecting military families from exploitation. The work that had begun with personal trauma had evolved into global influence, creating protective frameworks that were being adopted by allied nations worldwide. Military families represent the best of our national character, I concluded. My testimony. They deserve protection worthy of their sacrifice. The legislation before you today will ensure that no service member, anywhere in the world, faces the choice between military duty and protecting their family from domestic predators. As I gathered my materials and prepared to leave the hearing room, I noticed Marcus sitting in the public gallery. He looked older, worn down by years of consequences he had brought upon himself through his own choices. Our eyes met briefly across the room, and I saw recognition of everything I had become since his attempt to destroy my life. I felt no anger, no satisfaction at his diminished circumstances, no need for acknowledgement or apology. Marcus had become irrelevant to my story except as the catalyst that had revealed my true capabilities. He represented a chapter that had ended long ago, making space for achievements he could never have imagined, and success he had made possible through his cruelty. Walking out of the Capitol building into the bright afternoon sunshine, I thought about the young soldier who had once believed that love meant accommodation and that marriage required sacrifice of personal ambitions. That woman had deserved better than Marcus's betrayal, but she had also been capable of becoming more than either of them had realized. The transformation was complete. The victim had become the victor, not through revenge, but through purpose. The text message that was meant to end my story had instead become the first sentence of a narrative about resilience, growth, and the power of turning personal pain into protection for others. Marcus's attempt to destroy me had instead made me stronger than I ever could have been without facing that test. His betrayal had been the forge that shaped the woman I was meant to become, someone who understood that true power came not from controlling others, but from the courage to become fully yourself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.